I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of the State of Affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. On today's episode, we're going to look at JPPI's recent publication of the Jewish World Dialogue, an annual event that takes place in research that is done to examine the growing polarization and uncivil discourse within Israel and Jewish communities worldwide, especially when it comes in regard to Israeli government policies that affect religious pluralism in Israel, the balance of power between the Israeli judiciary and other branches of government, and of course, the relationship with what are known as the territories, Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank. This study was done prior to the October 7th Hamas massacre that led to the war that Israel has been engulfed in over the last 7 months. But what we saw in this report shows the cracks in the unity between the Jewish people, which are becoming increasingly apparent, especially in regard to attitudes in the diaspora towards the state of Israel. The researchers and the authors of this report heard heartbreaking reports in the different focus groups they did about denying acceptance to other fellow Jews based on political positions, people who categorized others as either loyal or disloyal to their Judaism. The authors of the report identified 3 contributing factors to the polarization. There was universal issues, there was what was happening in Israel, and probably the most interesting and complex of all relates to what does Jewish identity mean in the diaspora. So today we're going to talk with Dr. Shlomo Fischer, a senior fellow at JPPI, who was one of the authors of this report. And Shlomo teaches sociology in the School of Education at Hebrew University and Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He's also a research fellow at the Van Leer Institute. And his research has focused on the nexus of religion, politics, and class in Israel, as well as contemporary religion and sociology of the Jewish people. He's published extensively on radical religious Zionism, as well as West Bank settlers and the Shas movement. Interesting. Shlomo will talk us through the report. What was the main discoveries? What does it mean for the future stability and unity of the Jewish people, especially now in the aftermath of the war in Gaza? Here we go. Dr. Shlomo Fischer, thank you for joining the podcast webinar today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So we're talking about the recent report that you oversaw and authored and came out with on behalf of JPPI, managing the growing challenges to Jewish cohesion for 2023. And let me just say to our listeners that this project is an annual project that's done every year that looks at the division and polarization of discourse and maybe you'll tell us in a moment, the growing rift, the unifying factor, whatever it might be, between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews. But one caveat that we'll start off with is all of this was done in 2023, just before and finished before October 7th. But we'll get into that in a moment. But first, tell us about this report. What is this project?
Okay.
And what are the findings?
The project started in 2014 at the request of the then Justice Minister Livni. And the idea every year is to engage in focus groups with diaspora Jewish leadership and very engaged Jews about a topic of the day, about a topic that's of immediate importance and considered to be of high importance to the Jewish community as a whole. And we've dealt with various topics. We've dealt with relations between Haredim and non-Haredim in Brooklyn as well as in Jerusalem, and we've dealt with a whole range of different topics. And 2 years ago, we were concerned. I mean, when we started planning this, it was the end of 2022. Myself and my partner, Dr. John Muskay, who had been the CEO of the New York Federation for many years. Maybe many people know him from there. And it appeared to us then that the rift within the diaspora community was as pernicious as the rift between the diaspora and Israel. and we wanted to talk about that as well. And that at that time there was a lot of talk of the rift, which we even experienced between AIPAC and J Street, and that J Street wasn't legitimate. We'll come back to that in a second. So we were interested in so we wanted to talk to Jewish leadership about, is this perception correct? Is there a growing polarization? I'll define polarization in a second. Is this correct? Is there a growing polarization? What are its characteristics? What can be done about it? All of these reports have recommendations. We were tasked 10 years ago by the Israeli government to try and take the temperature. That's what we call it, to take the temperature of diaspora Jewry. We don't take the temperature of all diaspora Jewry, but we do try to get to talk to, the major aspects of the major parts of the organized Jewish community. And this year we're making real efforts, which I'll tell you about in a second, to reach even people who are not really affiliated with federations and stuff like that, with younger people especially. But
so tell us because 2023, even before October 7th, had the judicial reform, had this fear, for example, that Israel is slipping away from being a proud democracy. In other words, October 7th, people tend to look at that's the crisis didn't start then. The crisis started way before.
Oh, yes.
Right. And also not to mention the 5 elections that we went through as a country running up to 2023. So walk us through, what is the mood like among Jews of the world, North America in particular, looking at Israel at that time?
No, so when we started, and John was very insistent that let me just take a second and define what we mean by polarization in the context of the dialogue. And what we mean is when a certain topic or a certain discussion, a certain kind of discourse or conversation affects social relations. If you stop talking to your brother-in-law because of Israel, that's polarization. You can have different opinions, but if you say, I'm not going to his house for Friday night because, whatever, because I think he's anti-Israel, or I think he's whatever.
Or he's pro-Trump.
Pro-Trump. I mean, we found a lot of people who had said, and we had a question about this, is Israel the most polarizing topic? And majority of people said yes, that Israel is the most polarizing. And we meant 2 things. We meant the policies of the Israeli government vis-a-vis, call it what you will, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, occupied territories, whatever is your flavor. And the other issue was the issue of religious pluralism in Israel. And we started off with that before the judicial reform. We planned the whole thing before January. That was Yariv Levin's famous speech was in January 2023. So we planned it all out even before that, because we wanted to kick this off at the beginning of January. So all the planning and thinking was done previous to that. And we had a sense that, so that was the then, and people confirmed what we felt, and there was even an element of, we use small groups. We break people up into small groups, and people are more comfortable about talking about themselves.
What were the main findings in that sense?
Okay. The really main finding, if I can sort of jump ahead, was a theoretical one. And that's something which we want to do further research on, but it's a little bit theoretical. When you break Jewish identity down, and Jewish identity is a complex thing. Jews are people, Jews are a nation, Jews are a religion. It depends on what context. So a lot of there are at least three components to what people think of as Jewish identity. And we found that people reported that these components were coming apart. I'll make this a little bit more concrete. When I was a kid growing up in Crown Heights in the 1960s, so it was assumed that you can be Jewish, you can be pro-Israel, you could be a liberal, you could be a Democratic, you can be a liberal, you can be a liberal Democrat. And that all sort of went together. And now we have a feeling, now what we discovered, what people perceive, is that these three elements, the Jewish element, the national element, and the ethical universal element, which came out of the Jewish experience as a minority, and Jews for many years in the United States were, of course, liberal, and most of them are still liberal and still define themselves as liberal. These three components are sort of coming apart. And that's the root of polarization. So if I would say, you ask me what the findings are, A, that polarization happens because conversations and political positions are becoming markers of Jewish identity. It's not merely that you disagree with me. You're not a good Jew. If you disagree with me, you're an illegitimate Jew. And it's become, in other words, differences of opinion have become involved with what's legitimately Jewish, who's legitimately Jewish, who's not legitimately Jewish, who I don't want at my Shabbos table, who I don't want in my federation. I don't want to have to do with him. He's not really Jewish. He's a traitor. And I'm talking about words that people reported were being used. I mean, one guy said, I mean, this shocked even me. One guy said that he had to he asked one of his interlocutors, a right-wing interlocutor, to stop referring to the Israeli government as Nazis because of the disengagement from Gaza. I mean, that's pretty extreme.
So, but I mean, part of this obviously has to do with the Israeli government policies. Part of it has to do with the cultural shifts that we're seeing also across the United States. I mean, if you had to look at what's the percentage breakdown of who's to blame for this or what's to blame for it.
We asked those questions. We asked those questions, and a very high proportion said, it's the general thing. It's the general atmosphere of polarization. Trump contributes to it. In Europe, it's being contributed to by the populist parties.
Right. In Israel,
the woke people, Black Lives Matter. It's the general atmosphere. But there were a lot of people, like 25%, who said that it's the right. Them. And a lot of people talked about the polarizing language that the Israeli government used. We looked at this, so there was something to that. And so those were the two chief culprits that people saw.
What is the what are people are they troubled by it? Does it bother them, or is it just a fact of life today?
We asked them, do you think that the Jewish community, we asked them, do you think that the Jewish community cannot come together when it really has to against anti-Semitism and anti-Israel things? This is before October 7th. So a majority of the respondents said yes, they will not be able to come together. We will not be able to function in the face of serious threats to our well-being and to Jewish well-being. That's a pretty serious. Now, as it happened on October 7th, a large proportion of the Jewish population and of came together. So that sort of feeling that people had was disproven empirically, as it were, as people came together right after the massacres of October 7th and the war, et cetera, et cetera. But and I want to point this out, that the other thing that happened after October 7th was that positions that were considered in our discussion to be entirely beyond the pale, all of a sudden started to receive media coverage and become, as it were, visible,
such
Jewish voice of peace.
Explain.
In other words, that groups that let's say anti-Zionist or anti-Israel Jewish groups that had been like totally marginalized within the Jewish community, and when we conducted it, we were concerned not about Jewish Voice for Peace. We were concerned about the relations of J Street and AIPAC.
Mm-hmm.
And many members of J Street, you can criticize their stand on the territory, whatever you want, but they're people who affirm, most of them affirm, the state of Israel, the right of the Jews to a sovereign state,
right,
et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, after October 7th, you started to get at least media coverage of a bunch of Jews who had never been noticed before. That's Jews who are disowning the state of Israel, not in my name, are against the state of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. Judith Butler becomes a Jewish thinker. I mean, so on the one hand, the whole ground of polarization shifted. So on the one hand, you have the people who are basically Zionist and basically, in favor of a Jewish state, recognize the right of the Jewish people to have a Jewish state, are on one side. Then you have an element. I think it's very small. I think it's very small, but it became very visible in the time, and not least because of coverage by the Times and by New York Times and by other media outlets.
Do you anticipate that in the study that you'll be doing now this year, looking back at the last 7-8 months, right, since the war broke out, I know it's tough to predict, but would you anticipate that actually the people who are Zionists, who are pro-Israel, who do support Israel, they're actually the lines that used to divide them, like AIPAC, like J Street, like others, have now been blurred more than before?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I would say that, for 80% of the, let's say, the people affiliated with J Street, most people regard them as now within the camp. This whole thing about what do you do with the territories, et cetera, has become dwarfed with the idea that there's a whole bunch of people that want to destroy the state of Israel.
Right. Right.
So the whole grounds of discussion shifted.
What is the beyond the fact that there is this polarization and defining and identifying what it is, part of the report also looks at ways to mitigate it, right? And ways to try to bridge some of those divides within the camp. What were the main findings there?
So
and share with us, like, how can we be better people to one another?
So I'm telling you, we had 2 sessions of this year's dialogue. We've already, this week, we conducted 2 sessions with a group in Toronto and a group in West Palm Beach. And I'm going to relate to that as well, even though it's a little bit. And the real message that came out is more Israel education.
Mm-hmm.
More Israel, not Israel advocacy. Israel advocacy is very important. Everybody knows it's very important. We do this all the time. But Israel education, in the first instance, in the 2023 dialogue, it came out, people should know that within the Zionist movement and within Israel, there's a large variety of legitimate opinion about the issues of church, of religion and state, about the issues of the territory,
right,
et cetera, et cetera. And positions held by J Street are held by members of Knesset and even ministers in the Israeli government. It's not. And if you have a much broader perspective about that, so that's very important. That's just to know that, you can be a legitimate Jew and a legitimate Zionist and hold all kinds of opinions. There's no right answer for these questions. And that was the case since the 1890s. I mean, and if you have a sense of Zionist history and of Zionist ideology, then you become a much more sophisticated interlocutor. And that was on I mean, and then we also talked about, sensitivity training and listening and stuff like that. But that, I think, was the most important thing that you can do. Now, this has come up again in connection with the new issue of the campus pro-Palestinian demonstration, of the campus anti-Semitism, of the campus encampments and the harassment of Jewish students and the intimidation of Jewish students and stuff like that. And I asked the people in both of these sessions that we had, are the kids prepared? Mm-hmm. Okay, they come out of high school, they come out of day school, they come out of, supplementary schools or whatever Jewish education they get, or Camp Ramah or whatever it is. Are the kids prepared for what they face on campus now? And the answer was that the day school kids, they differentiated between the day school kids and the kids who go to non-day schools, public schools or whatever. They said the day school kids are very firm in their identity. They're not worried about that. But they don't know what to answer. Mm-hmm. They don't know what the pro-Palestinian advocates, what's true, what's false, what's a lie, what's propaganda. And what I'm getting from these people now, I said we're in the middle, it just started. But what I'm getting is the importance of Israel education on that as well. In other words, in Damashetashiv, as the rabbis put it, know how to respond when somebody puts an argument. So for both of these reasons, A, for understanding that there can be many varieties of legitimate Jews with many opinions about these issues of the territories or of religion and state or whatever you want to put it. And B, that when you're confronting the enemies of Israel, you'll know what to say. You won't be embarrassed. They won't shut you up. They won't, et cetera, et cetera. You can make an a coherent, cogent Israeli case. I think it's very important, not only for the next, what to tell people, but for yourself, that you should know that the Israeli Jewish position is well established, has lots of evidence, has lots of arguments, has lots of that. So I think that if you want to ask me what's really the key takeaway to become better on both counts, I agree with my colleague John Ruskay, who wrote an article in E-Jewish Philanthropy about this. I think it's Israel education, and that has to be. I know it's a huge investment because it's curricula, it's teacher training, it's the whole thing. But if you want to really invest in something that I think will have long-term impact on both fronts, so I think it's Israel education, and I think that's something that should be invested in.
What other recommendations were there in the report that you and John gave to the people who had participated and just generally to the Jewish community?
No, it was to the Jewish community. People did talk about listening sessions, learning how to listen, learning how to be empathetic, going through, and people gave examples that their community had sponsored a sort of sessions of this, a course of whatever, a couple of, at least one and two or more sessions, which involved with a professional facilitator of how to listen. People talked about conducting. People talked a lot about listening. People said that, one lady said that she walked out of a meeting because people wouldn't listen. I mean, and there was some people talking about rabbis stopping discussions about Israel because he said, just people just yelling at each other. There's no, so there was that kind of recommendations concerning those kinds of training sessions. And there was also, very practical type of stuff. Always conduct things in small groups. It's easier in small groups. You see more of a whole person in a small group than otherwise. Always have moderators, always have things like that. So there were a whole slew of what I would call tactical solutions.
Right.
Yeah.
Shlomo, what about recommendations for the state of Israel? What can Israel do?
Let's put it this way. I mean, the absolutely most important recommendation was to tone down the language. Mm-hmm. I mean, to say that the Wexner Foundation spreads poison, as Communications Minister Kare said a couple of years ago, people are aware of that, and people are aware, that kind of language, delegitimizing language used by figures of authority, used by Israeli government officials, people thought, I think, and I agree with them, if it had a deleterious effect. Sure. There's a constant request that Israelis should learn about the diaspora. That's in every dialogue. Israelis don't know anything about the diaspora. They don't really care about it, etc., etc. So that's for sure. But B, that Israeli officials, especially those now serving in the current government, should be a lot less vicious in their talk about liberal Jewish organizations in Chutz La'aretz.
Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like they're listening and heeding that advice too.
Yeah, I said it. I mean, but you can put this on the table. You can develop. I see every week in Haaretz there's this group that monitors language, and they give you sort of a statistic of who uses the most offensive language, and Miguel always comes out high on top, and people like, hey, we can do the same thing for Chutz La'aretz. I mean, you can sort of use shame to a certain extent.
But I do feel sometimes, Shlomo, that there is a feeling among Israelis that no matter what we do, no matter what we say, no matter how we speak, we expect that Jews around the world need to stand by our side.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. I mean, Israelis. There's a built-in shlilat hagolah, negation of the diaspora in Israeli culture, which is largely unspoken, but very much there. And the feeling is that what we do here in Israel, that's important. What they do in Chutz La'aretz, in the army, they talk about tomchei lechima. Yesh lochamim v'yesh tomchei lechima. There's the support people. But at the very most, it's the support people. But we're the real deal. We're the real show. Of course, Israel is totally built on this feeling of Israeli superiority. I mean, and which I probably share as well. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm any better than
no, but to be able to empathize, to have empathy, you do have to recognize that is not exactly the case, that superiority, or it doesn't help to give off that feeling of superiority to
right. Yeah, of course. It doesn't help, but this is a constant complaint of diaspora Jews. When we did when we did 2 years ago, we did the dialogue on Article 6 of the nation-state law, which says that the Israeli government takes upon itself an obligation to promote Jewish education in the diaspora. So the diaspora leaders had two reactions to that. A, it's very nice, and if they can help us with the financial burden, that would be very good. And B, who the hell are the Israelis to come tell us, what we should teach and how we should teach, etc., etc. And if they want to do something constructive, they should do curricula for their own schools about us, because nobody in Israel knows or cares anything about us. So
that's something that I've long thought about. When I worked a number of years ago with the diaspora ministry, and it was constantly thinking about how do we increase Jewish day school attendance? How do we create better curriculum? And it was also, have you ever gone to Misrad HaChinuch, to the education ministry here, and said, what curriculum do you have for us. They have now this diaspora week, right? Shavuot Futsot, where they
Ah,
are supposed to do something in the education ministry.
right,
It
because they
doesn't
never
really-
had anything. For years, they
No,
never had
no.
anything. I know.
And nowadays, even with this week, they don't really have much either.
I'm supposed to be in
What
Israel
ends up
no?
happening with the conversation oftentimes in Israel, what ends up happening is that the conversation about the tfutzot, about the diaspora, becomes a conversation about aliyah, about immigration,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Our target to the diaspora is consists of the fact that if they get into trouble, we will rescue them and take them here.
Right.
Basically.
So, yeah. Okay, Shlomo, before I let you go, so what should we expect in the upcoming report that will come out, I guess, end of this year, beginning of next, that's going to be looking more at obviously post-war or
I'll tell you
middle
what
of
we're
war?
trying to do, and it's not easy on a technical level, but what we're trying to do is to talk to the kids. Not
Which
to
is different
talk
because like this past year's report was more 30 and up, right?
correct. Even more 45 and up.
Mm-hmm.
It was this last year's report, for some reason, and well, because of the topic, we talked to advocacy organizations, we talked to J Street, we talked to Council of Presidents, we talked to other organizations, and those people in these organizations are older.
Sure.
They're older. So we want to talk to the kids. And we want to know, I mean, what is it like to be on a campus? I mean, I went to Columbia. I have no idea what it's like to be in Columbia now. I can tell you what it was like 40 years ago, but I can't. It was very different than it was today. But I don't know. What the kids really experienced. There was a very nice letter that some of them wrote. There was a very nice. I'm sure you've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
There was a very nice letter that some of them wrote. Does that represent everybody? I don't know.
Right.
So what are kids really feeling? One lady from Toronto said that her son, when the pro-Palestinian demonstration started, her son put on a kippah. Never wore a kippah before. Now he put on a kippah, and he said he got no reaction. He got no anti-Semitic reaction. And he said, "No, I don't know what you're talking about anti-Semitism. I have." There's lots of pro-Palestinian things. It never came to anybody threaten me or talk to me in fashion. So I think we have a lot of suppositions about what it's like. I don't know if we really know. Really know. And I assume it's very variegated. I assume that it's very variegated, but again, I don't know. So I'm really hoping that we break through, that we get hold of kids who are 18, 19, 20 years old, who can tell us what they feel, how they're experiencing it, and how it goes. That's what I hope will be in the new report. In the report that a year from now, hopefully, you'll be able to interview me about.
Okay.
When it comes out, we have a lot of work to do, but we'll do it.
So thank you very much, Dr. Shlomo Fischer. To our viewers and listeners, you can find the report Managing the Growing Challenges to Jewish Cohesion on the JPPI website. That's jppi.org.il. And thank you very much for joining us for this latest episode of Israel's Inside Analysis. We'll be back on Thursday for another episode this week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Great being here.